Sun from Place Matters. I think place is, huge interest to us at London Funders, and we've been really pleased to have some really great conversations with Joe and Emily and their networks of practitioners and funders over the last year or so, and getting to know more about what you're doing and what you're learning from Place in the funding world, and particularly around how that helps create different types of change. So yes, I'm going to hand over to you both. Thanks again.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here. But we know all about technical hitches. We're going to share some more stories. So well done for getting us on. So thanks everyone for taking the time to spend with us. What we'll do is just give you the 10-cent tour of us, just to start with. And then what we're going to do in the session today is share some of the work that we've been doing very recently with funders of Place, and what we've been finding out about what is happening, and perhaps more excitingly what might happen in the future. And then, if you would like to get involved, we will sort of tell you kind of what we're doing at the end, and share our details. And we'd love to hear from anybody that thinks this is going to be really exciting work and you'd like to join in. So first of all, just to prepare the ground, there will be a call to action at the end, so bear that in mind as we go on. Emily, I don't know whether you're in the seat to share slides. Should we just kick into the slides?
I can.
Through? Thank you very much.
Does that work?
It does. Marvelous. So Place Matters is kind of what it says on the tin. We are an organisation that was set up now sort of, well, we came together actually originally as a coalition of organisations, now sort of nearly 5 years ago, but we've been going more formally for the last 2 years. And the purpose of our organisation is that we're a partnership. So we're a very small organisation, deliberately small, and we're a partnership committed to accelerating the impact of place-based change through learning, through sharing and generating learning. And our hypothesis, if you like, is that in complex adaptive work, which we think place-based work in the way that we mean it, we'll come to explain that, is you need to center learning. Learning in many ways is the work, and that's largely what we're about, is connecting up, deepening the learning that we have in this work, so we are more likely to impact to create a better impact for place-based work. So next one, please. So say we're very small, so we're the core team is we're a partnership of practitioners, so the practitioner partners that we work with as core partners, and there are many others I should say, are on the right there. And the team that do more the day-to-day work, Emily and I are the co-leads, so we're the kind of we do the work every day. And then we're honoured to have two amazing chairs. So Dame Julia Cleverdon is our chair, and Lola Kabara from Global Black Thrive is our vice chair. So we have an awesome team. But we're building, the partnership is something which we're building over time, so we see that as something that will evolve. So again, if please get in touch and participate as we build that partnership going forward. Next one, please. So what do we do? Very briefly, three very broad things. First of all, starting at the top, we enable the work, so we get involved in working with places, capacity building in various different ways. So a couple of examples, we work with in Nottingham at the moment with 4 community groups that are just getting underway in tackling place-based change, and our role there is to help them navigate their way through the journey of that change, build their kind of knowledge, connect them to wider sets of learning. People have done this work before, so they can learn from others. And also we work in Liverpool with Liverpool City region in a slightly different way, where they're launching a really exciting and really ambitious regional programme to improve kind of outcomes for young people in Liverpool. They're rolling out over a number of years, and we're a learning partner there, helping them be learning-led in the way they work. So just to give you a feel. The broader ambition is that we build that, we build it through our partnership and through our own work and the work of others. We influence, use that knowledge to influence the way that this works, and those that carry the kind of the power to fund and the power to create policies are persuaded of the power of place-based work. and actually how working with communities is the way to go for many complex problems and more entrenched problems that sit in many of our communities, as we know. And also our job then to do is to bring together the large amount of resources and research that's in this space into a place which is very accessible, bring people together to learn together and use that research and resources. Thank you. Next one. So what we're going to tell you about today is more about, we brought together a group of funders and policymakers actually a couple of weeks ago. And this was the culmination of a dialogue that happened over quite a long time with funders around how place-based work is being funded and the opportunity to do that better. We had 16 regional and national funders, so it was an amazing event because really the main funders of this work were there, although many of you will perhaps argue around the table that weren't there. But we had a lot of people doing this work around the table, including DLUC as well as a policymaker. We also have 5 national practitioner organisations, and before that we did a series of one-to-ones around a number of questions about what people thought were the opportunities for change around funding, and we produced a think piece from that, which we're building following the learning event. And that's really what we want to share with you today, is what those funders thought were the opportunities, how that's now evolving into going forward into a series of actions that we hope you'll be part of. Thank you. So why is this important now in our view? So there's lots of reasons, but I guess the first thing is something that we see somewhat as a North Star in our world, if you can put it like that, is a galvanizing mission that needs tackling now, that poverty and the cost of living crisis is perhaps the thing that we think is something that suits place-based working and is the issue of the moment. You'll all experience that in different ways in your own work, but what Joseph Rowntree will say about that is that there's now over 14 million people in poverty in the UK, which is staggering. Over 4 million of whom are children. And perhaps even more staggeringly, over half of the people in poverty have an adult that's working. And 2/3 of children in poverty come from working families. So poverty is changing and in many ways is deepening. There is more destitution, deep poverty, not just poverty, not just income inequality. The communities that are most left behind, and if you use the indices of multiple deprivation as the measure of that, many of them have stayed the same. The bottom 10% are the same bottom 10% for the last 2 decades. Nothing's changed, nothing's shifted. It's not for the lack of money, there's not for the lack of government money or funder money, but they just are, they get stuck in that place and nothing's working. So the hope, we think, lies in our communities, and that's why that's why we're putting our hope and our work into place-based work. Thank you. So finally, how are we defining place-based change? So what we mean by that, and we know that there's lots and lots of definitions, including more physical space change, but what we mean by it is social change. So the way of working in places, it's a way of working in places that are defined by the people who live there and work there, and which has a clear identity. So it tends to be ward level or even sub-ward level. It's those people that feel that they live somewhere that they can name and they feel part of that community. It's about building new connections and cross-sector collaborations across people and organisations that live and work there. You have to restitch and deepen the sense of connection between those that can make change happen and give confidence to the people that in those communities to make change happen. And importantly, at the bottom, and in fact, probably should start, is to embed the experiences and voices of community in that work. So they're centered in that work. And we can talk a lot more about what we mean by centered in the work, because that creates the legacy, that creates the long-term legacy if the community themselves are driving it, part of it, and also inform the work that happens for them. So, Emily, shall I hand over to you at this point? Is that a good place to?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jo, and lovely to be here. And it was very nice to have London funders as part of that roundtable discussion a couple of weeks ago. And several of the participants that we saw on the list for this webinar were also represented there too. So perhaps you've heard some of the themes that have come out. But when we talked to the funders, there were a few questions that were asked to sort of challenge funders to think about how they can have greatest impact in this work. So one question was, how can funders and other actors, not just funders, but others who are involved in this work, accelerate genuine collaboration to create impact at the scale that's really needed now? As Joe mentioned, there's been a lot of effort, a lot of funding that's gone into places and work to try to reduce poverty, and yet we're going backwards. So something has to change in the way that we collectively are working together. So, and the second question was, what might be the future ambition of funders in enabling community-led place-based change and shifting the broader system? So this goes to the sort of one of the biggest themes that came out of the roundtable, which is that it's probably not enough for funders just to be funding place-based work and thinking about the impact they're having locally in terms of how to make greater impact. So it's what needs to now happen is thinking about how to unlock change at the regional, national levels, because there are conditions that are keeping poverty and other issues in place at the local level that local communities cannot always control. There's a lot they can do, but there's still lots that has to happen at the systems level, that working with communities to be able to bring about all the changes that communities really want to see. So how can then funders rethink their role to be able to manage that tension, but to sort of leverage their power in a constructive way, in ways that the community wants them to create strategic impact, and at the same time ensure that they are empowering communities to bring about the changes that they would like to see. So we've seen a massive discussion amongst funders, and I'm sure that you've all been involved in this as well, about funders needing to shift power to the communities. This conversation was about, yes, that continues to happen, needs to continue happening, because those with lived experience are the real experts in the place. On the other hand, communities are saying to the funders, don't let go of all your power, use the other power that you have to shift the bigger system, and please work with us on that. So that was a really interesting way of looking at power. So those were the kind of three questions, and what we'd like to do now is just sort of go into a little bit of the nuts and bolts and details of what was discussed, and maybe some examples as well. So we really thought this diagram was kind of helpful to put together as thinking about how the funder role has changed over the decades. So, decades ago, in a bygone era, funders and philanthropy was about generosity. How can I help others in need? How can we help others that are not doing as well as we are? And while the intention was good, there was a huge problem in terms of where the power was held. And again, we have, as a funder community and sector, we've shifted a great deal. But through that time, on the left side of the continuum or the timeline, there were a lot of charitable activities. There was a lot of talk about how to find best practice and then scale it up. If it works in Birmingham, well, it should work in Hartlepool as well. You just have to find the silver bullets and make sure that we scale it up as quickly as possible. Then there was this much more of a movement around, hang on, how do we understand the kind of impact we're having? We need to be much more rigorous about evaluation. And we need to bring in some rigor. So there was some discussions and change towards venture philanthropy, which is around how to bring in business skills and an investment mindset to philanthropy. And as that could progress, what a lot of funders then realized in speaking with communities and programs on the ground was actually relationship is really important, and the ability for funders to build trust with the programs and the communities on the ground is really essential for effectiveness and to start balancing the power differential that was not so constructive. And also what funders started to realize was that it's not just about giving money, but it's also about building capacity of organizations on the ground and programs on the ground. So then as we kept moving, payment by results, social finance, impact investing was a big thing. I think several of you probably experienced that as well. And there was some real, potential there, but also some real downsides and complexities to work through. Then in the past sort of 5 to 10 years, I think we've all been seeing a lot more discussion around how to bring in the voice of the community so that things are not being done to communities, but philanthropy and funders are working with communities. And eventually that communities should be doing this on their own more and more. So this idea about participatory grant making with those on the ground knowing how best to use the money, and how funders can shift that power dynamic to be much more about partnership has come into the fore. We now focus on the right side of the spectrum, which is around sort of what we heard a lot of in the roundtable, which is about, yes, it's important to shift the power to the communities. However, we need to think about this much more collaboratively in terms of how we can shift the needle on not just local systems, but regional and national systems to have real impact. And how can therefore funders work collaboratively with other funders and other actors like government, but also work collaboratively with communities in order to do this this very challenging work of shifting systems at a local scale, but also at a macro scale. So that's kind of a nice segue into the three sort of key themes that came out of the conversation in the context of that continuum, that shift into systems thinking. And the three themes that came up, and we'll take you through each of these in a little bit more detail and provide some examples. One is shifting from thinking as a funder that I'm a single player, and this is what we fund, and this is the community that we work with, to seeing ourselves as part of a much broader ecosystem of actors. So where do we see ourselves in relation to other funders? Where do we see ourselves in relation to other advocacy groups, as well as other government bodies, as well as statutory services? So the whole ecosystem of actors. The second theme was about, yes, funders have really become much more active in convening programs and convening communities together. But how do we shift from convening to really collaborating? And what's the difference between those two, and how do we make that happen? The third theme that came out was about, yes, capacity building remains really important and funding for capacity building, but what is version 2.0 of capacity building to, again, shift that needle on impact? So those are the three kind of themes, and would like to sort of take you in turn with each of these themes. The first one about sort of thinking about funders as a single player to part of a whole system. Again, it goes back to this idea and a common thing that came up, which is that when places are looking to change and make transformations that they would like to see, there was a lovely quote from Local Trust, which was that actually that type of transformational change at a community level takes half a generation. Some might say actually takes a whole generation or more. So this is complex work, and it's very long-term work. And therefore, in order to really work with communities to shift that needle, the funding it has to be seen on a much bigger and longer scale. And that really feeds into the second bullet point, which is funders are more and more thinking, well, if we are funding this, the community change at this point in the journey, who came before us? Who are the funders that came before us that we need to build upon their work rather than starting from scratch, which is often what happens. And if we are prepared to fund for 3 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years, there's some funders out there that are doing that. How do we think about the sustainability of our funding, and who should be coming in behind us? And who else should we be collaborating with as funders now? So what we found is that in this whole ecology of funders, regional funders who have very deep experience in a community have a very particular role to play, whereas national funders might bring in other things. They might bring in shared practice from other parts of the country. They might bring in networks that regional funders do not have. But both regional funders and national funders working together creates a much more impactful ecosystem of funders that can be much more sustainable for the place as well. The other thing is that, as we mentioned before, there could be other actors. So what we found is that funders are now thinking about, who else do we need to collaborate with here? Are they policy influencing bodies? Are there campaigning organizations? Are there capacity building organizations that we should be partnering with much more directly? As we work with communities to really shift the needle. So we're seeing that it's not just other funders, but other actors, as they were called, that they're thinking about more and more collaborating with. So the other dynamic that came out in the discussion was that having this ecosystem of funding and other actors was also not only fantastic in helping with that sustainability question, but also around shifting power, so that sometimes when it's just one big funder, there's more dependency that can arise, but also the power shift is very, very difficult, even with the funder's best intentions. But when you bring in lots of funders, there's a very different power dynamic that ensues, and that's more balanced. So that was the other theme that came out of that. Moving on then to talking about sort of where funders see themselves in the ecosystem of the other funders and actors, we wanted to just share a framework that we put together about the different types of roles that different funders might play. Now, this isn't to say that there's a good role and a bad role. All of these roles are necessary, but it's about funders being very deliberate about which role or roles they want to play and why, and just being very clear with the communities that they were working with, what role they are actually playing, as well as their internal organization and their boards. So this is kind of a nested levels diagram. And we start on the left side, which is the first part of that nest, which is the organizational level. Traditionally, many funders funded the organizational level. So they might have funded they might have provided restricted funding around particular programs. They also might have said, actually, we're interested in core funding and we would like to give you unrestricted funding to do what you need to do with that, and you decide. And within the organizational level, more funders have been thinking about capacity building support. And so we see for several years now, many funders have done things like grants plus or funding plus programs, where they bring together either peer-to-peer learning or specific technical learning opportunities based on the needs of the organizations that they were funding. That's kind of the first level. Funders have also since then moved into the next level, which is sort of place or network level. So the place could be a particular set of communities that they work with in a place. Network level could be if you're working at, for example, supporting young people who are NEET into employment. You might be working in several locations and places across the country, but you bring those players and actors together as a network of players in that sector to work together. So here we see funders are thinking about, how do we not just fund programs and organizations, but fund various multiple organizations within that sector or their place? Within that nested level, also you have some that are saying, we'll not only fund various organizations within a place or a network, but we also will help convene those organizations so that they can build a stronger network amongst themselves. And we see, for example, a Rank Foundation doing a lot of this type of work, but there are many others. Finally, in this part of the nested levels, there are others that say, we're actually really interested in working with communities and organizations in that community to achieve certain sets of goals and outcomes. And therefore, we will set together with those communities and the organizations working in them a set of outcomes together, but we will leave up to those organizations and the communities how they want to reach those outcomes. So you start to see sort of a little bit more on that right-hand side of the middle nested level, a bit more about that systems thinking. How can we help shift systems within a place or within a network? The next area that we go to, the final level of which we're calling sort of systems level, is where we see more examples of this probably in America and Australia and also Canada, where funders are saying we've got a role in funding programs, organizations, and places and building capacity there. But what is our role in really enabling research, policy influence, and really enabling learning to happen across the broader system? So some funders we're seeing are actually bringing in policy and advocacy capability in-house. And you could argue that there are some funders who do that, such as Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Perhaps SAVE is another one where they have a policy arm within their organization. And there's been a lot more emphasis amongst all funders we've spoken to around how to share learning, both the learning that they have gained in this work, but also much more broadly with other funders. We also see building collaborations with other funders and commissioners and investors coming to the fore. And we didn't talk about this before, but social investors are also part of that ecosystem of funders and actors. Where do they fit in? And maybe they fit in at a later stage when the community and place have come together and developed a strategy, and they're looking to scale the transformation in their place. Perhaps that's an exciting time to think about social investing as a way to bring in more capital at a point where it's less risky for investors, but can allow for more funding to come into that place. Certainly, we're seeing more of that happen also in America, but again, we're seeing that and lots of interest from social investors here in the UK. Finally, we want to just highlight something called field building that has really come up more recently, which is this idea that funders come together and build an infrastructure of collaboration. So with funders, policy organizations, researchers, practitioner organizations, working together with communities to, in a much more structured way, start shifting the needle at a sector level and at a policy level, whether that be the funding sector, the regional policy setting sector level, or national government. So we see this on the sort of more organized end of this sort of systems level thinking. Kind of difficult to keep talking at you without seeing all of you, but I'm just going to keep going, and then we'd love to invite you to bring in your questions. Just wanted to share a case study from an organization that is one of our partner organizations. They're based in Canada, called Tamarack Institute, and we see them really operating at that far right end of field building. And just in a nutshell, what they do, they've been around for 20 years, and they work very much as a capacity building force, working with communities all across Canada and now globally as well, more so. And if they really help catalyze collective action with diverse leaders cross-sector. And the 4 areas that they work in are ending poverty, building youth futures, deepening community, and addressing climate change. And the 2 main things that they do, and they've done it incredibly successfully with huge impact. One is they wanted to set up a learning center so that they can really share open source all of the learning that they have access to with any organization, practitioner, community, institution, funder that's interested in learning about place-based change work. They started with 12 communities 20 years ago. They now have about 45,000, actually this is out of date, it's now closer to 50,000 active learners participating in this learning center as part of a learning community. And several of you may have already experienced some of their webinars and their training resources, which are incredible. They also, over the past 20 years, starting with the 12 communities that they worked with, have really tried to use their capacity building skills and their knowledge generated working with communities to end poverty. And they, again, in terms of communities that they've worked with, they started working with 12, and now they were working with 400 communities, mostly across Canada and a bit of America as well. And some of the impact goals are very difficult to grasp in place-based work, as we all know. But of course, they're not the only ones working here, but clearly they've contributed significantly to Canada over that 20-year period, being able to decrease poverty levels from just under 17% to just under 5%, which is phenomenal. And they used and worked with other funders and government bodies, and of course, communities at the center to reduce poverty. And their aim is actually not to reduce, but to end poverty in that field building way. So they were able to work at the community level, but then were able to influence provincial government to come in on the things that they needed to do to reduce poverty. And then the federal government got wind of what was happening and said, if we work with provincial government and Tamarack Institute across the 400 communities, we can really start making a dent on poverty. So the Canadian government actually put it into legislation so that it wouldn't be at the whim of political parties changing, but they put it into legislations in 2015 that Canada would halve the amount of poverty over the next 15 years. And they have already done more than 50% of that goal since they put that into place. And they said we could not do this without working at all levels, starting from community levels, working with the field building collaboration of funders, provincial government, and local government. And so we see this as a really powerful example of what we could really learn from here in the UK. So back to the second theme that came up from the roundtable discussion is that shift from convening to collaborating. And some of the things that we have seen is that funders have already begun to make some real headway in this shift. And some of the learning that came through from the roundtable was, in order to really shift from convening to collaborating, is the importance, first of all, of having a very clear strategic aim. It's not just about getting together to do good work, but having a strategic aim. So for the Canadian communities, it was about ending poverty. And they then put together over a 5 and then 10-year period what that meant for that community and how they would go about doing that. And they worked with funders and with the municipal governments, or are equivalent to the local authorities and other statutory services, to make that happen, as well as third sector. So that strategic aim and being really clear about the what, even if the how is going to emerge throughout and is going to change with time, the what was quite clear, and of course the why within that. The other key learning that came out, which we see time and time again, is true collaboration that has impact really cannot happen without investing in resources and infrastructure to enable that collaboration to be done. Too often we see an incredible intent and goodwill to collaborate, but where it kind of falls apart and people go back into their silos and to do what they have always done and worked in their kind of isolated ways, because there hasn't been enough thinking about how people are going to do this on top of their day jobs, and really creating the infrastructure and the resources needed to shift the way of thinking about working together and shift how resources are used in working together. So that sort of shifting of mindset and ways of working really can't happen just because there's a good intent to do that. The third learning that came out of the roundtable is that collaborations often start off very well, but often can falter if the internal processes and the board or the governing bodies within the funder organizations are not necessarily aligned with the goals and power sharing approach of collaborations. So how can funders continue not working in collaboration with external organizations, but keep working internally as well to continue that journey and that mindset shift that is required to work in this way? The final theme that we wanted to share with you, and we'll share this plus a case study that illustrates that, is taking capacity building to the next level. What does that mean? Well, funders said leadership and collaboration skills and the tools to build planning and managing, and technical tools around business development, fundraising, contracting continue to be key areas of focus for funders. And what they've mentioned is that, especially in communities that really don't have a lot of that community infrastructure yet, this kind of capacity building continues to be really important and probably should be happening earlier. So this clearly is not going away as a need. However, on top of this, there was a discussion about sort of capacity building as a framework is evolving for a lot of funders. So it goes beyond just the knowledge and skills that communities are building and organizations are building within communities, but it's also about creating the space, which often community organizations don't have because they're so busy doing the work on the ground. But they all need that space and capacity to think widely and big, to make connections with others, and to try on different ideas. Again, change happens, and this goes to the third point, at the speed of trust. And especially when we're talking about change that needs to happen collaboratively and changing of systems, either at the place or a broader level, these things cannot happen. And this was brought out time and time again in the discussion, without relationships being built. And funders can really help build those relationships, both by the capacity building and the convening effort, as well as sort of the unrestricted funding that is really critical to that. And just to point in the direction of one organization that we see doing this in a really interesting way is Rank Foundation. And just to illustrate from one of the place-based funding efforts that they've been involved with in Dundee, which is a population of about 140,000, Rank Foundation, after sort of a year of meeting with lots and lots of people, they call it kicking the tires approach, but they met with lots of people across government and communities, and they just tried to understand what the community was already doing and where they might be able to support. And they then decided to support 26 different voluntary sector organizations over 5 years with core unrestricted funding just in Dundee. And their only ask was that they meet together as a cohort and to build a network across those 26 organizations every quarter, and to share what they were doing and to build relationships and to make room for those collaborations that they might not have been able to think about before. And so that they were really starting to build a network of the third sector together, rather than working in isolation, and in some cases, competition with each other for funding and other resources. So when COVID struck several years into this funding relationship, this network sprung into action because they already had relationships, they already had a WhatsApp group set up, and they began very quickly becoming the eyes and ears of the community, understanding where there was need, where there were gaps. And they very quickly were able to begin distributing food across the community so effectively that the local authority then said, "You're doing this so well, can we just give you funding to distribute more food to the community where it's needed?" So, and the local authority, because they found it such a great way to understand what was happening across the community, joined their weekly meetings to understand what was happening. This then evolved post-COVID into what's now called the Dundee Community Food Network, and a subset of the original 26 are very active in this community. And they are working with the local authority and other organizations in the community itself on not just, food banks, but really addressing food insecurity and addressing poverty as a whole, and with the principles of fairness and dignity at the center. So it's become a much broader, much more strategic effort that's very much collaborative and very cross-sector, and very exciting to see the progress that they have made. So again, apologies for talking at you for so long, but we're going to end there and just come back to the original questions that we started with. How can funders really accelerate genuine collaboration? And how can you as funders enable the thinking to broaden to shifting the broader system so that real change can be truly transformational and truly sustainable? And how can you manage the tension between leveraging your power where it needs to be leveraged to create real strategic impact, but at the same time let go of the power that should be with communities in terms of how the changes will occur with partnership with you and collaboration with you? And Joe, I'm going to just pass it over to you to share the call to action that came out from the roundtable.
Sure. I mean, I'll just do this quickly because I think we held the roundtable really to try and convene a conversation with funders that were interested. And we're particularly looking at this field building movement that Emily mentioned in relation to poverty, which I talked a little bit about earlier, and also to build a learning infrastructure. You will have seen from us what Tamarack have done. We think that's been incredibly impactful in building that learning community, and we want to sort of follow suit and do that in a UK context. So, and we're also looking to work at a regional level more deeply around field-building collaborations that work in a particular area and a place. And the reason for regional is because that's kind of where you want to influence systems actors. we think that works most impactfully if you're doing that at a regional level, where you're working with, you know, mayor authorities and others, where particularly you've got devolved administrations. So the final thing is to say, look, proverb, which is actually at the top of our the document we've created. So very well known, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I guess that's partly our philosophy to this. And finally, so please get in touch. So these are our details. We're going to put them in the chat as well. If you're interested in joining this conversation, that would be fantastic. But I'll leave it there in the hope that you will, and hand over back to Helen to see if there's any questions or thoughts.
Thanks so much, Jo and Emily. Really, really interesting. I think it's that I've heard you speak on Place a couple of times now, and every time there's been new kind of thoughts, new insights, made me certainly think about things in a different way. So yeah, I hope our audience has had some kind of things that have resonated with you as well, or kind of sparked some ideas in relation to the work that you're doing, whether that's in London or elsewhere. I'm just going to sort of give a couple of minutes, see if anybody wants to post a question in the chat, or kind of a reflection, a comment. Don't be shy. This is we've got about sort of 10 minutes left.
It'd be great if people just tell us, you know, does that resonate?
Yes.
You know, if it doesn't have to be a fully fledged question. We just love that, because we can't see you. Get your know kind of whether that makes sense to anybody out there.
Brilliant. Let's give it a minute. I know it's always hard to put people on the spot, isn't there? But someone has come forward, Callum. Okay, so I'll kick off. I'll just read it out so everyone can see. Interested to hear more about the work of the Tamarack Institute, and can you give any examples about the sort of initiatives that they've carried out?
I can start, but Emily's got a PhD on Tamarack. So Tamarack started, as Emily said in her case study, tackling poverty, and actually, just importantly, on that, they very carefully pitched that as not making poverty better, which is kind of let's you know, which and not dishonoring that, but food banks kind of make the experience of poverty better. They were about tackling poverty, eradicating poverty. So very carefully, their work on, which is called Vibrant Communities, was the first initiative that they started with. They've now basically branched out into others. So there's two elements to what Tamarack do. First is that they're mission-led in that field, and they are field-building catalysts. By, you know, before it was called a field-building catalyst, they were them. So that they are tackling things like youth futures. There's their version of Youth Futures. We've got a UK one too. So they're working with mainly young people from First Nation communities that live in a rural context, and they are tackling how they are disadvantaged in employment opportunities and other things as youth living in those communities. And they've become one of the thinking, apart from how do we tackle that problem, they've also thought very deeply around how do you work in non-urban environments. You know, we tend to focus on urban environments. So this, for small isolated communities, working in community in that context also has a very different dimension to place-based work. They're also tackling climate now, and Emily, chip in. There's a couple of areas that are coming top of mind, but they've got particular missions, and then under that there is a learning platform which provides more generalizable learning around place-based work that apply in any context, and those two sit together in the Tamarack kind of platform, if you like, that enables the kind of you both to tackle a particular mission. So, for example, on Vibrant Communities, one of the things they've done, which has been amazing, that over 10 years that they've been doing that work, that's more than that really, but they've looked at what are the trends, what are the things that communities do that work. And they've distilled it into 10 things, that there's 10 characteristics of it. So they've simplified it, not made it simplistic, but simplified it and made knowledge accessible, which is one of the really important things that Tamarack's done, which very much reflects the journey we're on, is making this really complex world legible and accessible to those people doing it.
Thanks, Joe. I don't know, Emily, if there's anything you want to add, or we can move on. Yeah,
I think that was a really good summary. Did you want us to move on to Susan's question, which also is a
Yes.
great question, Susan?
Yeah.
Thank you for that, about sort of moving from one side of the spectrum to the other, from generosity to social action to systems change, and social justice as well was mentioned there too. Speaking from a small funders perspective. So really interesting question, and a big question too. But it was really interesting to see that sort of pendulum shift from the sort of generosity model, where the funder very much held the power, to the other side, a side of that, which is really funders need to provide funding and trust to communities and let them get on with it. And there was almost a little bit, for some time, with some funders, not all, bit of a retreat. You know, communities know best. We need to just step out and get out of the way. And what we're seeing is actually communities coming back and funders saying, actually, that's probably not enough to sort of really shift the system. Social justice is a hugely big challenge and opportunity. There's a lot that has to change in order for real social justice to shift. And therefore, the sort of pendulum swinging back to say, how can funders and communities partner together where each plays the role that it can best play? So communities are saying to funders, we really appreciate the funding, but we'd also really like you to, you know, put us in touch with other places that are doing this work so that we can learn together. Can you put us in touch, you know, help us to open doors? And can you help with sort of the policy influencing side? Can you help amplify what's happening in our place and other places, so that it's not just us working alone, but it's about communities coming together and creating a movement? So what is the role of funders in that? There's multiple roles that funders can play in that, but it is one of real partnership, in each one using their power in the way that they can most constructively bring about the change that everyone wants to see. So a bit of a general response, but you know, it'd be great to sort of continue that discussion.
Thanks, Emily. Any other thoughts or questions or comments in the chat? I think there's a follow-up from Susan, and I might just pull that in if I may, because I think it's the point around which you made, you know, throughout several places in your presentation, around the kind of need for infrastructure and resourcing to enable that, you know, collaboration to happen, both, I suppose, within the funding community and also within communities. I don't know if there's anything else to kind of add in terms of thinking about capacity building and supporting that infrastructure within communities, kind of what you've seen work well, whether it's either through some of the work in the UK, but you also referred to some, you know, particularly in Canada and the US and Australia and other places. Anything which particularly, I guess, stands out in terms of being effective?
Joe, I'm happy to kick off with the sort of backbone idea, and then if you want to pick up on the sort of field building bit, that sort of is a nice parallel. But I'm sure many of you actually are familiar with collective impact as a framework. It's more of an American term, but I know that some are using that. And clearly, Tamarack Institute really embraces the sort of principles of collective impact. And what it is just a way of working in a place-based manner, where cross-sector organizations and community with residents at the center come together and do things collaboratively. And so they talk about, in this framework, several conditions for this to work. One is having a common agenda across all the sectors and parties coming together. One is shared measurement, so that each organization is not just having their own measurement, but there's a common sense of measurement that they're all working towards. Another one is interconnected activities. So again, not siloed working, but how do our activities come together and create the whole that's much greater than the sum of the parts? And then another one that gets often overlooked, which is so critical, is this idea about a backbone infrastructure. So collaboration just can't happen, as we talked about before, just because people add it on top of a very, very busy day job. And we know that the lives of those working in local government, working in community organizations, statutory services, they're getting even busier, not less. So one of the conditions of collective impact is needing to put into place an infrastructure, or it could be one person, it could be half a person, that really stitches together this collaboration. So they help to really shape the shared purpose and the common agenda. They help to get data that everyone can share and can help inform the work. They help with community engagement. But without that resource, it's really difficult to go from a desire to collaborate to anything really changing on the ground. And Joe, I don't know if you want to mention, sort of how that translates into field building.
Yeah, in a similar way, I think there's lots of forms of what would generally get called intermediaries in this work. Backbone's one form of intermediary that's perhaps the best known. I think the in the field building catalyst example that Emily gave earlier, the where you've got a set of organizations spanning from people that influence national things at a national stage to people that create kind of depth of systemic working locally. You do again need something in the middle of all of that to make it work. And again, it's a backbone, or a backbone of backbones, as we sometimes call it, or a catalyst organization. It's again sometimes called, but it's an organization that essentially holds those relationships together, makes the whole, the sum of the parts in essence. And what we find again and again and again, if that's underinvested, doesn't exist, or underinvested, things fall apart because lives are too busy, people are too pressured, and you need to actually feed the beast, if you like, of making this work. So having an effective catalyst. Now, the catalyst itself and the backbone itself can be just very small. And importantly, what we also see is that they transfer power over time. One of their jobs is to get rid of themselves as you create legacy. And that's true of, the field building catalyst is perhaps sometimes on a very long journey, but ultimately it's a movement for change. And when you've done that movement for change, you've moved it as far as you can, the catalyst sort of, that's the job. So how you constitute that and where you put it, because it has to have that objective to walk away and transfer power out, is quite important. So we found it's organizations that set themselves up deliberately with the capacity to kind of manage that change of power.
And sometimes that backbone function could be within a local authority group. It could be within an existing community organization, especially at the place level. Often it's not a brand new organization, because actually you need that backbone to be trusted and to be really part of that place. So they could very well be part of an existing organization who's part of that collaboration.
Brilliant, thank you. We are 1 minute to 5 o'clock, so it's probably the end of the day for most people. So I will try to wrap us up on time. Firstly, thanks so much again to Joe and Emily for providing such a thought-provoking session, and generously sharing all of those insights that you've been kind of gathering through your work. Really, really interesting. And I'm sure if people were here, we would see lots of nodding heads. So I know it's always a bit unnerving speaking into the black hole of a webinar. So, but really, really good. So thank you both. I know you said in the chat, Joe, that you're happy to share the slides. So if that's okay, we'll share that with participants. And I think your contact details are on there too, if anyone has any other follow-ups. So yes, thanks to our participants. Thanks, Joe and Emily. Apologies again for the slight delay starting. But do check out the rest of the festival programme, sign up to other sessions. And we hope to see you again soon. And we'll keep talking about place. So we'll look forward to continuing this conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Cheers.